What do you think makes a good developer experience?
I think you can break it down into a few different things, like having amazing docs, having an amazing onboarding experience, making it super easy to get started, having a lot of starting points, having this sort of gradual revelation of complexity where you can start with a small set of primitives and then sort of layer things on, making things into kind of composable Lego blocks, where you can get to know one or two concepts and then, build with those. Fast feedback loops, I think, are so important, just the ability to iterate quickly. Consistent naming, naming things proper things. I have strong opinions about this, but I hate config. I think everything should be programmable. Modal has 0 lines of config. There's no YAML, there's nothing. Everything is code. To me, it's it boils down into a lot of elements like that. And then that to me is good SDK design.
Yeah, I think coming from a consumer background and knowing what it's like to think about consumers natively and how do we make this experience delightful for them, plus being a developer for yourself makes all of those things true.
I think another thing we've done really well is it's fun to have a personality and an identity. I'm not looking forward to the day when it's going to be all about, white papers and magic quadrants and all that stuff. I hope to be able to keep our sort of consumer mentality for a long time.
Okay, Erik. Well, first, I feel like I've actually seen a lot of you lately, including a few weeks ago in the Modal office in New York. I know it's been a lot of Erik time. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm excited to get into your story and into Modal. It's such a loved product. I actually had a dinner last week where people who are Modal customers were raving about it. So always fun to talk about.
Nice.
People love, yeah.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So maybe to set the scene, how do you describe what is Modal?
I start out by saying it's infrastructure for data, AI, machine learning teams. And then I typically talk about how we run a lot of infrastructure in the cloud, a lot of GPUs, a lot of CPUs. We then make it easy to use those through a Python SDK. And in particular, we've seen a lot of traction that's been in Gen AI inference, but also some other places like computational bio. And I tend to mention a couple of customers like Suno in particular, AI generated music, and they use Modal for a lot of stuff at pretty large scale. So we have a lot of customers like that, doing all kinds of Gen AI stuff.
Yeah, I love Suno. We have Mikey coming on too.
Yeah, nice.
So we'll get more into Modal, but I'd actually love to take it back and just hear, why is Modal the company that you decided to build? Of course, you mentioned the Gen AI use cases, which I'm sure are much more common now than when you set out to start the company. And you have this really interesting background of, 6 years at Spotify. You built their first music recommendation systems. You ran a 300-person tech team as CTO of Better.com. There was Annoy and Luigi. So why not, a workflow scheduler, a vector database? You just have all these rich experiences that could have been companies potentially.
Yeah, I quit my job during the pandemic essentially, and then I was kind of fun employed and playing around with different things. And one thing I started thinking a lot about at that time was data, AI, machine learning space. Seemed like there's a lot of stuff to do, and it's always been frustrating to work with from an infrastructure point of view. And I have a background in that space. You mentioned Luigi. Luigi is a workflow scheduler, open sourced in at Spotify a very long time ago. No one uses it today, by the way, but for a while, most people used it. So that was actually my original idea. I'm just going to build a better Luigi, like Luigi, but now it's 2020, and it's very different. So I started hacking with that, and what I realized at some point was that in order to do Luigi, the workflow scheduling right, you have to nail the execution of code right. So I started hacking on that. And by the way, hacking, I just meant it was just kind of a personal, just pet project for me.
Not necessarily a company is coming out of this.
Yeah, I mean, that was always kind of one, potential outcome. But I also thought about maybe I should do some contracting, maybe I should just whatever. But I just got carried away.
I said you were exploring.
I was exploring, yeah. This was during pandemic. My kids were running around screaming in the background, and I was working from home. And but I got carried away about this. I was like, this is super cool. I should build this and turn this into startup. And suddenly I was writing code 12 hours a day. And I mean, this is funny because also previously I used to manage 700 people. So it's also kind of a way for me to go back and just geek out and just.
I actually saw that you still do that. I forget, there was some post of how you spend 10 to 20% of your time still coding.
Yeah, probably more, unfortunately.
It's your natural orientation, so it's hard to step away. So okay, so you were exploring. You decided at some point, I'm going to build a company. I actually don't hear you talk about this often, but I feel like as an investor, something that you often hear is, okay, like the co-founders, do they know each other and have they battle tested each other and worked together, for 5 years building some project? So Akshat, who's amazing, I know this is a little bit further into the Modal story, but I want to hear how you decided to work with him.
Yeah, I think, frankly, I wouldn't give this advice to anyone, but I mean, I didn't know Akshat, but we decided to do this together, it worked out for us.
Is this just like you trusted Zach Frankel and then Akshat was so good?
Yeah, that's roughly the story. I mean, Akshat also has like a similar background to me. We're both like old, sort of competitive programming people, and I don't know. I just did it off with him. Like I could tell, like he's just super mature in the way he thinks about technology and about like businesses, and so yeah, we decided to join forces, and he quit his job at Scale and moved to New York too, which is kind of a big thing. And then we started hacking this together.
Yeah, I love this story because even if it's not generalizable advice, it's just proof that sometimes the generalizable advice is just bullshit.
Yeah, I actually think in this case it is probably good advice to not start a company with someone you don't know, but whatever, it worked out for us.
There's always exceptions, is the point. Okay, so you set out to build Modal. What was required to take it from, okay, I think I'm gonna, I've been hacking around, I'm starting a company, to your very initial launch? And I know that you all were grinding for a bit before that initial launch.
I mean, you have to remember this was the ZERP era. So we were like just high on confidence. We're like, we're just going to build some cool technology. Like
the money was flowing.
The money's just going to come. Like, and so we, I mean, I always had like a pretty strong point of view that like, this is something that makes a lot of sense, the technology, but this was pre-Gen AI. And so we immediately started building some very deep technology, like on the infrastructure side, we spent a bunch of time building container runtime and our own file system and a bunch of stuff. And then a year and a half in, this is summer of 2022, we had like zero revenue, zero customers. We'd raised a bunch of money at that time. Stock market suddenly collapsed. I don't know if you remember. And I realized like, yeah, we should probably try to figure out how to get customers and how to drive revenue. And so I think that's kind of entered kind of a new phase in the company. Luckily at that time, Gen AI suddenly, appeared, in particular Stable Diffusion for us turned out to be sort of the killer app. A lot of people started coming to us and they're like, Modal looks like a cool platform and it looks like you have a bunch of GPUs. So can we run Stable Diffusion on Modal? And that's when we started getting traction and actually kind of found some notion of product market fit.
So in retrospect, we'll get into that product discovery and finding the product market fit, but are there technical decisions that you made early on that, then when you actually got this demand from folks working on Gen AI and who need inference proved to be really critical in retrospect?
I'm not sure. I think in general, it's very good to listen to customers and iterate with customers, but customers will always tell you it's like random small things. And I actually think it was good in the first year or so at Modal that we didn't do that. We talked to a lot of customers, but we also had like a very strong point of view of like, what is the infrastructure that the world lacks? And I think actually in a way big part of that comes from the fact that I had been working on these things for probably like 10 years prior to this. So like I had a pretty strong vision of like what I wanted to build.
And I'm sure there are many examples of that. Like I'd actually love to hear you talk a little bit about BYOC versus multi-tenant infrastructure, which I'm sure is something you hear from some customers.
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of strong views at that time and still have. And one of the things that I always felt is like, the cloud is here to stay. And actually, in fact, I actually think we're kind of still early in this adoption of the cloud. And so thinking a lot about like where things were going, one of the things I realized early was that let's not even do BYOC, bring your own cloud. Like let's just like build like a cloud hosted platform and just go all in on that. Because if you do that, you might exclude certain customers. But A, the product experience for the people that are comfortable with a fully multi-tenant hosted model is just so much better. And B, I think in the future, like those customers are also going to be comfortable with it. Just like in the past, like people weren't comfortable with the cloud, eventually like now it's like so natural. I remember when the cloud came, I was like, how can I put my code in someone else's computer? It was crazy. But like now everyone does it. And then Snowflake came and I was like, how can I run a database? So I think there's been a lot of sort of trailblazing and this sort of a realization. So on the BYOC thing, I sort of expect that to change too. And I think for us, it's been kind of important to focus on one particular infrastructure solution.
So on the technical decision side, you build a lot of things internally, your own file storage system, your own customer container engine. Do you have a certain way to decide or framework when you want to buy, when you want to build? I'm sure that some people told you were crazy.
Probably. One framework, and I feel like I need to write a blog post about this, is like, I actually think you can mostly just like do gradient descent on like what you need and what customers tell you to do. But you need to be careful to also, when it comes to like building hard technology, the way I actually think about it is like kind of a different framework, which is what's the acquisition value of this company? Like I always like think about in the early days, like I found that kind of be like a good framing for the first couple of years of the company is like, if things go to hell and like we need to sell this company, how do we just sell it for the most amount of money possible? And I think big part of that is like solving hard technical problems. Because then, and so that was like kind of one framing that I thought about as, which is not necessarily like the only way to look at it, but I pretty quickly realized like in order to deliver the developer experience we wanted, we would have to solve some really hard technical problems. And so that was like one reason to do it. And then the other reason is like, eventually other people are going to realize like in order to to deliver on this developer experience. So I kind of like, rationalized it in the early days. Like, yes, we're spending like a ridiculous amount of time building this, very, in-house core infrastructure, and maybe we're crazy. But on the other hand, like if it doesn't work out, like it's still probably like good because we can always like sell this technology.
I mean, everything comes at an opportunity cost, but also the time investment. Like if you want to make container cold starts faster, you have to start investing in, I spoke to Akshat, he said that you all invested in memory snapshotting like a year ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, also like the other thing I think a lot about is like just what's your core competitive advantage, right? And like if you at its core, if you're an infrastructure platform, but you're just using other people's infrastructure, like you really don't provide that much differentiation, right? And in that case, like what's preventing someone else from doing what you're doing? So like I think it's very clear that like if your core competitive advantage is the infrastructure, yeah, you better be innovating on the infrastructure side.
Okay, so Gen AI comes around. All of a sudden, people are interested in stable diffusion. You see inference as a new use case that Modal is very, very set up to serve. I guess what was it like to scale then? You mentioned Suno as a customer, and Suno has grown very, very quickly. What do you need to do on your end to scale with these fast-growing customers and AI use cases?
A lot of it's actually GPU capacity. So besides the scalability and reliability, which is always challenging, right? Like, you have to scale your system from, 10 requests a second to 100 requests a second, to 1,000 to 10,000, right? Like that actually, in a way, like I think that's like kind of an easy problem, not to sort of trivialize it, but I actually feel like, scaling problems are like things that if you look at other startups are like it's like the best problem to have.
Better scaling than shutting down.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, I even like think like, like platform stability issues is like out of any problem you can have is like, not a bad thing to have because it like good engineers can always solve those things. On the other hand, it's also like getting GPU capacity. So that's also something we had to spend a lot of time on. It's like just, aggregating a lot of different regions, aggregating a lot of different cloud vendors. Like we need to have the ability to burst up 1,000 GPUs all of a sudden. We couldn't do that unless we like got GPU capacity from a lot of different places. So there's also a lot of like innovation we have to spend. We have to spend a lot of time like building that system too.
What goes into that system? I've heard you say that you don't want to become WeWork.
WeWork of GPUs. Yeah. I mean, so like what I'm referring to is that GPUs are expensive, right? And so what you don't want to do is like you don't want to like sign all these like long-term contract and then rent them out like by the second on the other side, and then which is exactly WeWork's business model. And then you have a pandemic, and you're sitting with this long-term liabilities, but you have no revenue. So and I think there's something similar you could do in theory with GPUs, and I think that's like kind of dangerous. So like for us, it's always been important that like yes, we do get a bunch of our capacity through reservations, but we also get a lot of capacity essentially just on demand at spot, and that's like nicer in a way because it's like we get $1 in, we pay out like slightly less than $1, we collect the difference, not too much risk on our side. When you're sitting on inventory, when you have reservation, you always take a little bit of risk, which is like we're comfortable with some amount of risk, but not like, all of it.
At the end of the day, you still have to do capacity management though. So I'm not buying GPUs or renting GPUs. And so I don't know how challenging the capacity management is without assuming more of that risk.
Yeah, we have to do some of it. But the nice thing is, like, I think multi-tenancy is as close to a free lunch as you can get, or resource pooling, right? Like, we have hundreds or thousands of, decorrelated users. So pooling all those users mean, each individually, they have like various sort of, high variance workloads. But once you pool them, it's actually kind of smooth. So that makes the capacity planning a lot easier from our point of view. And I also think fundamentally capacity planning is part of the value we create, is that you don't have to think about capacity planning because we do all of that for you. So when you're using Modal, it's all usage-based. So you only pay for your time you're actually using. And I think that's a big part of also the value proposition for many people.
I heard you're pretty obsessed with this too. Like, you have a bunch of scripts to get spot pricing in every region. You plot them out and you're always sneaking PRs to continue to optimize GPU allocation costs.
Yeah, it's funny because like on one hand, like I'm spending too much time on this. Like I really, on the other hand, it's like hard to find someone else to, like, I kind of want a CFO, but a CFO can write code. That's like, I think a hire I want to do at some point in the future, because like
there may be more of those in the future. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if
because
this is what's demanded from the CFOs of the future.
I kind of feel like it's needed, like, at least for us, like, because like the spot pricing or like all this like GPU pricing, it's like very complex and requires a very technical understanding. And a lot of that pricing you can only get through APIs. So I mean, you kind of need, to understand. I'm actually not that good on the financial side, but at least like I understand the numbers.
I heard you do this with optimal temperature and CO2 levels in the office too. So it's not just spot pricing around the world.
Is that right? That's just me. I become radicalized by the indoor air quality. So I have a CO2 monitor at the office, and I make sure. But it's not that, it's like the most easy control theory in the world. Like, basically, when the CO2 level goes up too much, I just open a window. And then when people complain that it's too cold, I close it.
When people complain it's too cold, you're like, it's good for you. Look at the graph.
Yeah, exactly. Also, like, people's optimal working temperature is actually slightly colder than what they think they want.
So how do you think about margins given this? You're assuming some risk, but for the most part, you have this multi-tenant infrastructure that allows for bursts, for lack of a better word, allows your end customers to not be thinking about GPU capacity planning. So how do you think about margins, and what are good margins for something like this?
I mean, we're never going to have software margins with this business. And, but I think we can get pretty good margins, especially since I think of the compute platform as just the starting point, right? Like, over time, there's so many opportunities for us to go up the stack and layer on, like, higher level features, whether that's, whatever, real-time streaming or like enterprise features or charging for different things. Like, I don't know, but there's just so much stuff to do, right?
Do you have theories around what some of the higher level services you would go after are?
I mean, all those things, right? Like, like we're in training right now. We're very interested in, like, I don't know, feature stores. There's a lot of, like I said, like enterprise stuff. So I think all of those things like drive up revenue, the margins in the long run. The other thing is, like, I think margins is actually kind of not necessarily a goal in itself. Like, to me, it's like, it's always more of a proxy for like risk. Like, Spotify had actually very slim margins, but Spotify, which I spent 6 years at, on the other hand, like, the margins were always, they were exact because it was a rev share model. So I think as long as like we have control over like the COGS in relation to the revenue, like, I think it's actually fine to be thinner margins. I also think that fundamentally, like, pricing matters, but people are willing to pay a premium for the Modal experience. How much that premium is, like, I don't know. Right now, I would rather err on the side of smaller margins and higher growth. As GPU prices come down, I think the relative value of software differentiation relative to the COGS will go up. So I think over time, you look at AWS, like EC2 is a 40-50% margin business. So it's not a bad business.
I know we sort of talked about this at the beginning, but why start with a runtime versus these higher level services?
I think it's just very hard to go. One theory I have is it's very hard to go down in the stack, but it's easier to go up. I don't know if that's entirely true, but generally speaking, I'd say, if you start higher up in the stack, if you start out like delivering software, it's very hard to integrate backwards and then build a cloud service and like do it. Yeah, I mean, some companies have done it, but like, my theory is like starting with the compute layer means like we're in a really good position to then integrate the other stuff. And especially when I look at like the data infrastructure landscape, like a big challenge, I think, from just a developer experience point of view, has been the lack of integration between the compute layer and the layers above. So nailing that, I think, is very core to what we're doing. We could have started higher up, but I think that would have put us in a much harder position to integrate with the compute layer. The other thing is, like, frankly, it's so much easier to monetize compute.
Yeah, for sure, especially right now.
Exactly, right? Like building higher up in the stack, I think, is a little bit harder to grow revenue.
Even services aside, I mentioned I was at a dinner with my friend Alex at Axiom, and one of the things we were talking about when we were talking about Modal is that how it makes distributed computing feel local. So, you no longer have to think about spinning up EC2 containers and SSHing in, and you can just, like look up a remote function, call it from your local Python script on 1,000 containers, get the result you want. And so I'm curious how you think, and I'm sure not just think, but see it, but how you think in the long term this shift changes software development and data engineering. Instead of spinning microservices on every PR to do full integration tests, are there other examples of what people can do with Modal that would be unthinkable in the more traditional cloud computing world?
Yeah, and Axiom, by the way, they're an example of a biotech customer, and that's kind of originally like the type of customers.
I know Axiom and Chai.
Yeah, we have a bunch of computational bio customer, and actually that was like more of like the use cases that I started Modal kind of targeting. It was more like, I almost think of it as like HPC, right? Like, high performance computing and making it easy to build compute intensive applications, like whether those use GPUs or not, right? I think across like different domains of software engineering, it's gotten a lot dramatically easier to write code over time. Like I look at like front end engineering, like they kind of figured it out. They have like one window with the code, and then they write it, and then another window with like the website, and they look at it, and it's just like live updates. Like it's like very fast feedback loop, right? Backend engineering, something similar. Like I think Kubernetes kind of works for them. I think when you work with like data and AI and stuff like that, like I think the developer experience has actually gotten worse in the last few years with cloud, like trying to jam everything into Kubernetes with Docker, like, and those are like things that don't really work for those types of customers. And so I think that was like what I set out to solve, is that I love the cloud and I love this idea of having, instantaneous access to so much compute and stuff like that. But the developer experience was always kind of bad working at that. You have to build a container, push that container to the cloud, download logs. Like, so the feedback loops are really bad, right? And that's the thing that I started with, which, that was the first thing we decided, like, we're just going to focus on this thing, like make the feedback loop super fast when you're running custom code in the cloud. So that's a thing, that, to answer your question, hopefully Modal will change.
Okay, so I'll take you to the next step. What happens then?
People are going to run a lot more compute in the cloud because, now it's easier. And I think that's a good thing, because there's so many compute intensive problems that people should spend a lot more time on.
You mentioned that one of the ways to succeed here is you listen to customers, and we just gave the biotech example, but we talked a lot about Inference. Are there things that you're seeing from your Gen AI customers that you view as next on the product roadmap that you can share?
Yeah, I like one thing that we've seen a lot is more recently is a push for lower latency inference. And this is not, like a new product necessarily. Like this is more just like taking what we have and like expanding it to basically a slightly bigger set of use cases. And in particular, there's a lot of like real-time translation, speech-to-speech models, like real-time video models. And in all of those cases, like people want to go from 100 millisecond latency down to 10 millisecond latency. Gen AI initially was like kind of a good use case for us, because actually like hasn't been that latency sensitive. So people don't really care where the GPU is. You can even like, it's like too big a problem is like, you take a little bit of text, you send it to a GPU, maybe that GPU is in Australia, I don't know. Then that GPU does like trillions of calculations, and then it sends back a little JPEG or something like that. So physical location hasn't really mattered. But when you're pushing it to really low, and also speed of light is very fast. When you're pushing into like 10 millisecond latency, now you really have to think about physical location. And so that's like one of the things we're working on, is like, how do we reduce the latency within the model system and kind of spread out the control planes we run in many different places, we can get to 10 millisecond latency, whatever.
What's the biggest challenge in cutting latency?
We just have to re-architect everything, because right now we run workers all over the world, but the control plane only runs in one region. And so distributing the control plane, it's a big challenge, because now we're like dealing with like a distributed system all of a sudden.
We've talked a lot about inference. Are you seeing other things from your Gen AI customers, ranging from fine-tuning to even pre-training?
Yeah. I mean, a big class of our customers use Modal not just for inference, but also actually for pre-processing. So because Modal does, and this is actually a use case we always target, was like, I think of these like embarrassingly parallel use cases, which is often the case for, let's say you're training a video model. Typically, the first step of training a video model is you want to operate something on I don't know, terabytes of video data, extract frames, and kind of compress them down into like sensitive feature vectors or whatever that you can use in your training script. So, or similar for audio or images or whatever, right? So that has actually been a pretty common use case across a lot of our customers, is like pre-processing training data. And then they train often outside of Modal, and then they come back to Modal for the inference. The other thing we're really interested in like doing now is actually training.
I was going to ask what you think of distributed training. So
yeah,
needed question.
Yeah, and we're not going to target the like 1,000 GPU use cases. I think those are going to be hard for us to do. People are very price sensitive, etc. So but like I think there's a lot of interesting use cases in like 16 to 64 GPU use cases. So that's something we're really excited about. Is trying to figure out how to, and a lot of people are actually training models for those. Like outside the LLM space, the LLM space is obviously kind of crazy. Models actually not that big outside the LLM space. So when you look at like video, image, audio, or like computational biomodels, like they're typically smaller anyway. So we think there's a huge opportunity in that space. And the nice thing about doing that is like then people can do the pre-processing, they can do the training, and they can do the inference on Modal. And we sort of manifest or sort of materializes this vision of the end-to-end platform for machine learning development.
Two questions. One is, what are the major benefits of distributed training?
Just faster.
And then two, are you mostly seeing non-LLM use cases? I know it started with Stable Diffusion. What are you seeing on the Gen AI side?
On the Gen AI, yeah, we definitely see in terms of modalities, like LLM is a use case for Modal. And people do fine tuning, people do various custom inference and batch embeddings, like things like that. I would say in general, like the OpenAI, OpenAI, their API is so good. And obviously Anthropic and a couple other ones. So in that space, like there's definitely like less of a demand for like people running their own models on their own GPUs or using Modal and things like that. So when those needs arise, it tends to be very custom workflows or things like that. Or fine tuning has actually been like a common use case. And fine tuning is useful in certain various types of domains, but not always. Instruction tuning actually turns out to work pretty well in most cases too. So what we've seen is that actually it's been like video, audio, image, computational bio, like that's been the sort of places right now. Recommendation systems, LLM is something, it's probably some percentage, I don't know, 10-15% of our revenue, but it's not our biggest market right now.
Right now, a lot of attention is being given to inference time compute. I'd imagine for the non-large labs, this is not something that they're thinking about a ton, but are you thinking about it, given that this will require more compute at the inference level?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be good for us. That being said, I think it's like, frankly, like very early days. Some of the stuff like actually makes me a little nervous because I think some of it is like cope for the fact that we're running out of training data. So like people are like, oh, should we use synthetic data? Should we use inference time compute? Like, I feel like a lot of that is like, okay, what's next? And I don't necessarily know. I mean, O1 is obviously working, so I think there's some promise there. But I'm sort of cautiously optimistic. Let me put it at that. Like I do, and I think if we find more use cases, I definitely think for Modal it'd be a great thing because we do inference really well, and we can handle very sort of bursty, needs for compute capacity and things like that. But I'm also not necessarily betting the company on inference time compute at this point. But cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, it's something to keep your pulse on. I mean, just, to your point, coming from NeurIPS, I think a lot of the discussion was we've run out of a lot of the low-hanging fruit data on the internet, which goes into pre-training these really large models. Like, that is not true for a lot of these models that you're talking about in different domains with
Definitely not.
domain-specific data. Definitely
Yeah.
not. And you also mentioned that they're much smaller models, and I think there's a lot more to do there. There's also more data too. It's not like pre-training is dead, but
No.
yeah,
There's
post-training
so much more
scaling
data.
laws, inference time compute scaling laws were a little bit the name of the game or the theme of the week. While I think it's still far from hitting these other models, it could be an interesting opportunity for Modal.
Yeah, for sure.
So, in building all of this, everything from, again, like your own file storage system implemented in Rust, your own container system, you need a really, as the young ones say, cracked team. And I know that you and Akshat are like cracked IOI engineers. But how do you attract the best team to actually go and build this?
I mean, a lot of it is just kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like just having good people is I think the best way to get more good people. I think the other thing is like maybe having interesting hard problems, and we definitely have a lot of hard technical problems.
Well, maybe like first 5 people before you look around and you say, wow, Modal's where all my really smart friends work. I want to go work there.
Yeah, I mean, we hired some really good people. Like among the early people, obviously me and Akshat, we were the two that started it. Other people that joined early was Erik Zhang. This is phenomenal young engineer from Harvard. Also IOI gold medal, crazy open source stuff all over the internet. Just, like I said, super cracked. Richard Gong, another IOI winner, not winner, a gold medal. Also super smart engineers. So we had a couple of like super smart people early days. And I think that was sort of created a snowball effect that we got a lot more people. I also hired a lot extensively from my own network, people I worked with in the past that I knew could be really good for the role. Hired a couple of people. We have a bunch of people over in Sweden, but like in general, like I have a big network at Spotify, and a lot of Swedish people, a lot of Americans too. So we've hired extensively also from that network. And the nice thing about having a network that you can pick people from is I know which ones are good for which roles because I've worked with them in the past.
Okay, so you have a bunch of cracked engineers. I heard that you don't really have product people, which I think is potentially a hot take. So I want to hear about that. And you didn't have any go-to-market people until 6 months ago. 2 questions in one. How do you orient around like these shifting tides and what your customers need and all of these different personas without product people? And then when did you decide, like, I'm ready to go in building a go-to-market team?
I'm not against product. I just think when you're building a very, very technical product, engineers like kind of can do it themselves because like at the end of the day, like you're building for yourself. Like the persona, our target audience is another engineer.
I'll reframe as, how do you keep the engineers product oriented? Or is it just inherent to the people you hire? And
I think it's something somewhat inherent, right? Like, and that, but that being said, like some engineers like gravitate more towards like deep infra and just like solving stuff on a Linux kernel, optimizing performance, whatever. Some engineers are very interested in like, let's design a beautiful SDK. Let's think about our, I'm probably more of that actually personally. And but that's kind of goes back to like thinking about how I picked the team, or how we hired people. We hired people from on both sides of the spectrum.
Before we go into the go-to-market question, I'll double down on that one, which is like, what do you think makes a good developer experience? I know it's maybe more art than science. Are there essentials that you think of?
I wrote a long blog post about it the other day. I think the short answer is like, I know it when I see it. I think the slightly longer answer is I think you can like break it down into like a few different things, like having amazing docs, having an amazing onboarding experience, making it super easy to get started, having a lot of starting points, having this sort of like gradual revelation of complexity where you can start with the small set of primitives and then sort of like layer things on, making things into like kind of composable Lego blocks, where you can get to know like one or two concepts and then, build with those. Fast feedback loops I think are so important, like just the ability to like iterate quickly, consistent naming, like naming things like proper things. I mean, I personally also like, I have strong opinions about this, but like I hate config. Like I think everything should be programmable. Like Modal has like 0 lines of config. There's no YAML. There's nothing. Everything is code. So to me, it's like it boils down into like a lot of elements like that, and then that to me is like good SDK design.
Yeah. Well, how about thinking about the personas where, the comp bio people may look very different than there's this new AI engineer title that folks are talking about where a lot of the people were software engineers and maybe are doing some work in AI. Some of them are MLEs. And so how do you marry developer experience with insert word for developer, whether it's computational biologist, whether it's AI engineer, whether it's MLE?
To us, it was very clear that we built this for like the machine learning engineer crowd more than the sort of like you mentioned AI engineer. Like that tends to be a crowd that's more have the roots in like front end development. Frankly, they tend to be more like TypeScript or at least like backend engineer. I mean, Modal is Python only right now, and Python is the most widely used programming language. So like we focus on the high code crowd, like people who want to write code. They don't necessarily have to be like the best engineers in the world, but like we focus on people who want to build stuff with code. We're not trying to dumb it down. Like we're not trying to do a low code solution or no code solution. It's not writing code in English, writing a prompt. Like no, it's like you work with Python when you work with Modal. So that's the target audience.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think that as AI engineers have shifted from more like MLE origins to software, I've definitely seen a lot of Python with now maybe TypeScript is the secondary language.
I think so, and we'll definitely add a TypeScript client in the future. But I've seen this so many times in the past where I'm old, right? I've been programming for 30 years. Like I think my feeling is like there's been so many times, like just like 10 years ago or 5 years ago, there's just so much demand for data analysis. And at that time, there was like a movement like let's just do everything in SQL. And I think like a lot of that makes sense, but at the end of the day, if you want to do like really crunch data, like you have to write code. And so, there's this like moments of like extreme demand for something. And then I think that extreme demand, at some point, like people realize like you can only get so far, not like really going deep on these things. And so it's, like another example, even more extreme would be all these tools that let, whatever, like product managers do dashboards without code or whatever, so they don't have to use engineers. Eventually, it just goes back to the engineers. And then eventually you just have 10x more engineers than you expected, right? I think there's this like cycle like that's repeated itself so many times. So like, oh, we don't have engineers. I wish I could have a tool that lets me do this without engineers. And then eventually like that to me is just the sign that like, no, we need more engineers. And so, we have 10x more engineers in the world today than we had 20 years ago. And I think give it another 20 years, we're probably going to have another, even not 10x, but at least 5x more engineers.
I mean, the flip side is what you make easy and what you can still control as the engineer. So, like in many ways, Modal, it's abstracting away what
for sure.
MLEs need to do. And that's fine and that's dandy.
Engineering has always moved up layers of abstraction, right? We're not writing assembly code anymore. We're not writing machine instructions. Like we use compilers, we use high level programming languages, we use frameworks, we use relational databases. Like we move up abstraction, and Modal is part of that, right? I think AI assisted software development is just that too. Like it's just another tool that makes us more productive.
100%. So, okay, so back to the go-to-market. You didn't have any go-to-market people until 6 months ago. When were you like, yeah, it's time, we're ready?
I have a consumer background, and Modal was always like very focused on developer experience. So I think for us, and I'm not saying this is for every company, but for us, relying on PLG, product-led growth, like worked really well for the first 2-3 years. And still, I think that's like the core of the company. I often liken ourselves to like Datadog or something like that. Like, like starting with like a PLG, clear notion, right? Like Datadog didn't have any salespeople until they had like, 50 million in ARRs and crazy stuff. So it's not been until recently that we started, thinking about sales and marketing. And marketing for the first few years was basically just me like posting shit online about Modal, and people got excited and tried it out. Now I think we need to increase the surface area a little bit more. So we're also posting shit on LinkedIn, and we're also trying to do maybe other marketing venues. We're trying to do more webinars, trying to do more video. And so now we're starting to invest more. And, we have a amazing developer advocate, Charles Fry. He's been working with us for about a year now.
I feel like Modal has, if you think of this Venn diagram of even the hyperscalers, there is some functional overlap, even if it's not everything. And so how do you think about positioning yourself in the market?
Yeah, I think we're kind of one layer above the hyperscalers, but we're definitely one layer below most AI startups in the sense that like we're focusing more on this like running arbitrary code in the cloud. And I don't know if there's like a ton of obvious competitors in that space. There are some, right? Like, you could argue maybe like Databricks is a competitor or Anyscale or something like that, but I don't know. They're very enterprise, they're much later stage. So I don't see the hyperscalers as competitors. Like we use them at the end of the day, right? And much like, Snowflake.
You're driving their compute.
Yeah, exactly. We're driving compute to them. So like I see them as like great partners. They're excellent at operating EC2 and other products and doing that at scale and making tons of money, right? Like we're a layer above and we focus on developer experience.
How do you think about scaling sales and go to market, or is it still in early innings?
I'm trying to figure it out right now. Like sales is starting with PLG. It's been non-trivial. Like, how do we layer on sales? Like, what do we do in terms of outbound? What are the insertion points? What is our playbook? I'm working on it. Just today, I'm like working on trying to figure out the commission plan. And so ask me in like 6 months. I'll probably have a more clear answer. We have one salesperson who's been with us for about 6 months. But when we hired him, like I told him, like your job right now isn't necessarily to drive revenue. It's to figure out the sales playbook. And that's probably going to take 6 months or maybe more. Once we figure it out, then your job is to drive revenue. And then we're going to hire more AEs, by the way.
What is the biggest focus over the next year?
No, I mean, like to me, actually, like the biggest focus is driving revenue. It's like, as much as like it's like I'm just, building technology for the sake of technology. Like I think we've been pretty good at finding a market for this and we've grown quite a lot. And I think the next challenge for us is like, okay, we have this like clear product market fit, especially with like startup customers. Like how do we take that to enterprise segment? How do we take that to other verticals? How do we take that to other use cases, training or whatever it is? So to me, in 2025, I want to see at least 3-5x revenue. I want to see a diversity of use cases. I want to see us focusing more on enterprise customers, more enterprise logos. Those are all sort of very clear sort of business goals that we're hoping to get to.
Are there big technical challenges you anticipate in expanding that go-to-market?
Everywhere. This is so much stuff we're going to have to build, right? Like we were just like, why I like Modal. It's like everything is a technical challenge at the end of the day. Like if there's one thing I kind of, there's like, if you build it, they will come. Like, and people say that that's wrong, but I actually think like, it's like kind of right. Like at the end of the day, like sales is always like kind of a lagging thing. Like the product quality is always the most important thing to being, to building a successful company. Like you can't build a successful company without having like an amazing product and solving a lot of hard technical problems along the way, right? Of course, sales also matters and go to market also matters, but on the engineering side, like that's where the core value is being created. And so, we're gonna have to solve a lot of tough challenges over the next many years.
I think that's always been your philosophy, that like build a really, really, really good technical product with good developer experience, and then everything else comes downstream of that.
And and to be clear again, like I don't want to trivialize the downstream stuff. Like I constantly talk about stuff. Like I'm blogging, I'm tweeting, I'm out there selling. We have other people blogging and tweeting and selling, right? Like there is a lot of work there too. But at the end of the day, like you also have to spend most of your time thinking about the product you want to build.
Yeah, I didn't mean to trivialize it either, or at all imply that you do, because I know you don't. But I think coming from a consumer background and knowing what it's like to, think about consumers natively and how do we make this experience delightful for them, plus being a developer for, you called yourself old. No, that's not true. You just started programming very, very young.
I did that too, but yeah, I'm also old, but on the point about consumer, I mean, I think, I look at your hat, like I think one of the things I think, and we're not alone to do this, but there's like a sort of consumerization of the enterprise, right? And I think another thing we've done really well is, I think it's fun to have a personality and an identity. And you know, DBT is a company I think did this incredibly well, had almost created these like movements, right? And I think that, you know, we're taking a different approach, but we've always like try to have an identity in everything we do. We try to have, you know, do fun stuff online, like giving away crazy hats and stuff like that.
Totally. I mean, and you feel that, right? People are excited, not just by the product, but by the company and the brand.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm not looking forward to the day when it's going to be all about, you know, white papers and magic quadrants and all that stuff. Like I hope to be able to keep our sort of consumer mentality for a long time.
Yeah. And we had I've been to a few fun events at your office, including our breakfast a few weeks ago. While that has always been your orientation, this very developer first orientation, I know that you have an internal Erik bot that's fine-tuned on all your Slack messages on Modal Slack. I'm curious if there's something that you think you would disagree with the Erik bot about. If you kind of fine-tune on your past self, your opinion has updated recently.
I mean, it's like funny, like with any LLM, and I think with especially with the Erik bot, it's like it says things that kind of like when you skim through, they all like sound like pretty profound, and then you're like kind of read the words, and you're like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, what the fuck does this even mean, right? But it's like has this like surface level, like, you know, sounds pretty smart.
I'll ask you a different personal question and a final question, which is, how have you changed as a leader and as a person since starting Modal?
If there's one thing I've learned about like leadership and management is like, you know, every year I'm like, you know what, like 2-3 years ago, I was really bad at it. But now I think I figured it out. But now but like at this point, I felt that way for like 20 years. So like, I'm probably still pretty bad at it. So like, I actually don't know, you know, I just like feel worse and worse every year at this stuff. I'll tell you one thing I've learned is like, one thing I've learned, but there's so many things, is like, it's actually kind of good to hire people like friends sometimes. Like I used to be nervous about it, but like more recently I've hired a lot of people just like from my own personal network. And like, you know, obviously like we vet people and we make sure people go through it, but working with people you know really well, it you know, it makes us so many things easier.
It's counter to my Akshat point, which maybe was a once in a lifetime miracle, but I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah, it's like one of those like Tobias Funke. It's like, you know, but it might work for us.
But it might work for us. Okay, well, Erik, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time, and good to see you as always. And thank you for letting me be the one to wear the Modal hat this time.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. This is a lot of fun.